Yeah, I feel as though I owe you all each a personal favor for having come along to this. So yeah, I thank you. And I'll leave some time for questions so we can questions. So this is about social media, AI stuff. 3 different things I'll talk about. So it's more stuff at the intersection of technical AI and policy making. Just to let you know, I've sort of done a little bit of this. I started off working on this stuff sort of nationally in New Zealand, organizing groups like this, basically very interdisciplinary, just to talk about it and try and make the conversation as broad as possible. I also co-founded a Center for AI and Public Policy several years ago now. And the New Zealand government comes and knocks on my door and asks about AI policy. Internationally, I'm in GPay, like lots of the people in this room. It's a sort of theme, I guess, because the organizers are from GPay. So there's a little bit of sort of recruitment from there. Being in New Zealand, I'm also part of the Christchurch call to eliminate terrorist and violent extremist content online. That's very much a social media initiative. And that's something I'll talk about quite a lot. I'm also in the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism. I've been in a couple of working groups for that, and that's very connected to the Christchurch call. And then more recently, I've had various connections with EU regulators in some of these AI-facing regulations that are either out there or in the process of being developed. So there's lots of conversations. In this bullet point, I should have put artists as well, and it's really cool that we're going to hear about artists later on. I guess the key thing is I'm really interested in how this conversation can be structured. How can we have an efficient conversation? How can we make sure that the people who need to talk to each other do? How can we avoid redundancy? How can we make sure we don't miss things? And that's a really interesting question. And just before I start on social media, just a couple of thoughts on that. I think these are interesting. This is at least sort of the way I started. So as a way of kind of getting going, it's often interesting to look at smaller problems or more circumscribed problems or areas. So looking at individual countries, especially if they're small, like my one in New Zealand, you can do some interesting things. And the place that I started, and I think this is a good idea actually, is to look, both for governments and for individuals, is to look at how a national government uses AI themselves. And the reason why is that you have additional principles of transparency that apply in this case that simply don't apply in commercial AI. There's this principle of open government, which means that all things being equal, citizens should know how the government works. And if the government is using AI algorithms, you've got a particular sort of mechanism to get at that and to find out and to have rights over finding out how that works. The government can immediately implement its own decisions as well. So that's another nice thing, is that the government, since it's in charge of itself, it can put its own house in order if there are things to change. There are also some rules for commercial AI use that can be decided nationally. I won't go into those, but just to say that you can do things very locally within individual countries, and that's an interesting place to look at for people who are interested in AI policy making. Other uses of AI, of course, need international discussions, and the internet uses of AI are often of that sort because, of course, they cross national boundaries, and especially if they're big tech companies, they're all over the world. So, and of course, those big tech companies use a lot of AI, enormous amount, like social media, I'll talk about, it sort of runs, AI is completely the engine that runs those systems. And also, maybe because of that, I guess the big tech companies are the places where most AI is created these days. There's several reasons for that. But so those uses of AI need international discussions, and that's what I'm focusing on today. So I'll be talking about AI in social media. And I co-lead a project on that topic in GPay. It's part of the Responsible AI Working Group. And GPay, as we've heard a few times, it is an organization that participates in this international conversation about AI, specifically on the technical side. It's a grouping of technical experts in AI, and that's what we were hearing from Inma about yesterday. It's this interesting collection of diverse technical people. So we're looking for technical problems that can benefit from technical solutions. So in our working group, we work on 3 types of AI systems, but each has its own issues. So just very briefly, these are the things I'll talk about. Firstly, harmful content classifiers, an automated AI classifier. It's a paradigmatic AI system that looks for harmful content. Then there's recommender systems. That's the thing that chooses for you individually what goes into your daily feed, for instance, based on what it's observed that you like. And then there's the new generative AI systems, which are a bit different because those aren't part of how the social media company is set up. But social media companies need to be concerned about what is being posted from generative AI systems onto their sites. And so that's a slightly different one, a slightly broader, and I'll finish with that one. And that's the one that Imran was kind of plugging me for yesterday. So a key thing there, and this is already an interesting point I wanted to draw to your attention, is like there's 3 different types of AI system, but in relation to oversight, I think that you often have to, different AI systems used in different contexts require different questions, and there are different issues that we have focused on in these cases. So for harmful content classifiers, our focus has been on definitions. It's like, how do you define a certain sort of harmful content, like hate speech, for instance? How is that done? Who's supposed to do that? So who's in charge of making the definitions? And there are questions there which go to policy, I suppose, as well as to mechanisms. For recommender systems, the question is sort of different. At least the question that we think is most important is different. That one is to do with the effects of the AI system on the people, on the users, on the platform users, I suppose. So what effects in particular do recommender systems have on users' engagement with harmful content of various different sorts? And to echo what Nico was saying yesterday, how do you measure those? And so I'm also a kind of measurement geek, and especially in this one, how do you measure the effects? What are the best ways of doing that? And finally, for generative AI tools, ChatGPT and Midjourney and so on, how should social media companies deal with the AI-generated content posted by users? That's a broader question, but again, it's a matter for social media companies to think about, or maybe to have policies about. Okay, so harmful content classifiers to start with. So those things are certainly necessary. It's like we need moderation, or we need censorship. Right? You can call it censorship, and it's a difficult thing to have to accommodate. Given that everyone likes free speech and everything, but you really need a harmful content classification to support human content moderators, because there's this enormous volume of content to monitor. And if you want to keep your platform safe, you need to be aided by automated classifiers, classifying either text or images or videos or whatever. But censorship is, of course, a really it raises many sort of very emotive issues, and we need to know how censorship works. We need to know how, in particular, because we're AI focused, we need to know how the automated content classifiers work that identify or flag harmful content of various kinds. And at present, companies don't tell us very much about that. In fact, they tell us a lot of things, but there's a lot of things that we don't know. We often don't very much about how their classifiers are trained, for instance, in particular, how the training sets for their classifiers are developed. And we don't know how well they perform. They tell us various things about that, but what they don't tell us is what any AI student has to provide when they give a classifier to their professor. They have to say what percentage accuracy is on unseen training examples that have been held back from training. Is it 99% accurate? Is it 70% accurate? What's the accuracy? Any public competition, evaluating classifiers would ask for that number, but we don't have that number for the classifiers deployed by big tech social media companies, and that's a real problem. So our suggestion is kind of a radical one, and we're piloting this. And so I'm really curious in your ideas about how this looks. We're just starting working on this. We're suggesting that some of the processes involved in defining and training a harmful content classifier can be brought out from behind the closed doors of companies into a public domain, or actually a semi-public domain. The idea is, and so I'll describe a project that relates to developing a training set for a hate speech classifier. And that's our focus. Because hate speech is particularly important in relation to sort of keeping platforms safe in areas of, which are relevant to the democratic stability of countries and things like that. So here's the principles that we're sort of like using to support the method we propose. The idea is a sort of democratic idea. So decisions about harmful content in some given place should involve democratic consultation of people in that place, or particularly users of the platform as it runs in that place, I guess. They shouldn't be made by companies. So that's already quite a sort of bold statement, and I'd be curious to know what you think. Here's another one. And again, I'd be curious to know what you think. At the moment, all the different social media companies have their own in-house training sets. And that feels very inefficient for one thing. You know, they could pull their training sets, but it also feels weird that they're not using the same definitions. You know, when you build a training set for harmful content classifiers, you're basically operationalizing a definition of harm. And because they all do this differently with different training sets and different methods, they all have slightly different definitions of harm. But why should that be? It also feels weird. You know, is harm here different from harm over here? And here's another one, and I think we're on safer ground here. So you really want to consult the people who are the victims of hate speech or the subjects of hate speech when you come up with definitions, because those are the ones who live the problem that it creates, that have lived experience of what it feels like to be attacked in that way. So here's, okay, we're GPay, so we have to be technical about this. And here's our sort of technical suggestion for what we can do to align with those principles. So the idea is that basically the whole process of creating the training set for a harmful content classifier should be constructed outside of companies. And the idea is that you basically kind of create what you might think of as like a citizen's jury or something like that. And how you form that is a big question. You want to somehow sample people representatively, perhaps with a particular focus on the people who are subjects of the harm that you're trying to annotate. Of course, you want there to be discussion and training, but you should also completely allow disagreement. The whole point is, you know, we're not classifying cups and tables and dogs where you can expect inter-annotator agreement. Where in areas of political opinion here, you can expect a wide spectrum of opinions. And in particular, you should expect a wide range of opinions for this really hairy area of borderline content. And our project thinks quite a lot about how to do this. And this is, you know, this is one area in particular where you would like the processes involved in deciding what counts as borderline to be made more public than they currently are. But here's another thing. If the training set is curated in a public domain, semi-public domain, you can also imagine how it could be shared between companies. And that's amazingly useful for a start, because now companies can sort of make use of the same resources. They don't have to reduplicate each other's work. But there's another benefit to that as well, which I'd sort of want to, again, to get your opinions on. It would be very nice if there was this data set of harmful content of one sort or another, which all the companies had to train their own classifiers on. So their harmful content classifiers are, of course, in-house. They develop their own ones. And you want to know who's got the best one. And that's the way that AI research has always happened. We've always had these public competitions where you have a data set that's made public, and then you ask your labs to go away and train their things, and then you hold out a portion for evaluation, and then you run a competition and see who's best. And that's how progress is made. And why should it be any different in this commercial domain? So the way we're thinking about this is that the way of defining hate speech can be, you know, if you're sort of deferring to the population, to the population of users, then you can have this concept of local governance, which companies are often kind of like unhappy with or sort of uncomfortable with. They want to run the same thing everywhere. But well, what counts as hate speech in one country is very different from another. You know, I'm not sure how, you know, hate speech in New Zealand is one way, hate speech in, you know, in your own countries. You would want that to sort of be defined by people in that country or in that region, I think. And so you expect some measure of, you know, going back to my original point about sort of more local units, you can imagine some measure of regional control here, or maybe national control. So in GPay, we've just added a project that models this kind of public curation of a hate speech dataset process. It's running in India. It's quite new and it's very small. It's just a pilot. The domain speech is the domain is hate speech in political contexts on Twitter mostly. It's a mixture of Hindi and English. The Twitter datasets comes from discussions that came before one of the elections where there was enormous violence that led to a lot of death. And this is sectarian hate speech. So we're very interested in how a community of people from the relevant parts of India can collectively sit down and work out what counts as hate collectively. That's what we're trying to do now. Key idea there is that annotation schemes should be operational. And what I mean by that is that a category that annotators identify should be linked to a moderation action inside the company. And we do that in two ways. One of them is very discrete. So the first round of annotations just involves consultants saying, okay, this is so bad that it should not be on the platform. It should be removed. And we have various definitions of that. And then there's another one, which is like, this is completely fine. You don't need to do anything with it. No action needed. And in between that, of course, there's borderline content. But then for borderline content, there's some other thing you can do, which is, again, completely operational. If you think, what should a company do with borderline content? What they should do is something in the recommender algorithm which disseminates the content. If it's, so it's on the platform. But if it's almost something which you want to take down, then you might want to choose to downrank it in the recommender algorithm so it doesn't get widely spread, or much less widely than otherwise. And if it's only a little bit borderline, well, okay, downrank it a little bit. So there's a continuous measure of downranking, which is available to companies. Very, very subtle kind of moderation tool. And what we'd like to do is to build an annotation scheme that links to that by delivering a continuous measure of harmfulness in this area. So this is in the pipeline, and there will be some results about this at our summit, which is in India, coincidentally, this year in December. Second topic is recommender algorithms. This is actually one we started with. So a recommender algorithm, as I already said, it's a complete AI system. It's pure AI. It's a machine learning tool. It does supervised learning in the simplest cases. These days, there's also reinforcement learning schemes that are actually much better and much more widely used. But basically, it curates a user's daily feed for each user. It learns what that user likes by monitoring what they click and what they like and what they comment on and so on, all the usual signs of engagement. And then basically, it learns to give them more of the same. So there's a potential problem for this, which is, again, a complete AI problem, which any person who knows machine learning would sort of like immediately think, oh, okay, this is going to be problematic. This is going to be unstable. It's the fact that these things learn continuously. They're monitoring continuously, and they're constantly revising their model of each user and about what they like. So here's the problem. The user is choosing from things and engaging with stuff that the recommender system is suggesting to it because that's what they see coming into their feed. And so that's what they're engaging with. Well, what that means is that subsequent learning by the recommender system is likely influenced by the previous learning, which is what led it to give you that feed in the first place, right? So it's a complete circle. Okay, so it's giving you some things based on what it thinks you like, and then you're going to click on those things, which means you're basically confirming what it thinks you like to some degree. It's a positive feedback loop. It's non-IID data in AI terms, machine learning terms. What this means is that users are going to be led off in some weird direction. It's going to be unstable. And here's the real problem. If users happen to have a cognitive bias that pushes them in the direction when they're choosing between the things that they're offered in the feed high up, if they have a small preference for more extreme items, then recommender systems might end up learning to provide increasingly extreme content in one dimension or another. And let me just give you some evidence that users do have small preferences for extreme items of different kinds. So this is all in our first report on this, which you can see on the GPay website. Users have, all other things being equal, a preference for, in political domains, for moral and emotional content. Things that say, I'm just outraged, it's a disgrace. You want to click on that for some reason. And I'm not sure why that is. It's just the way our heads are built, but that's what we like. And this is a similar one. We have a preference for negative moral emotions called moral outrage. Here's another one. This is not to do with content that's good or bad, but it's like, we like to hear about the others. We click on, things about other political parties, for instance, or other politicians that we don't like. Here's a mind-blowing one. Information that is false travels faster than information is true. This is a well-known result, but it hooks into this in the sense that, if you have things which are false, they're going to jump out as particular candidates for you to click on and like. And all of these things are things that your recommender algorithm might learn about you. Oh, Ali likes false, likes this kind of weird conspiracy thing, or Ali likes this highly charged political content. And if you imagine that this is kind of a nudge which you're getting constantly and constantly providing additional feedback to the recommender algorithm, you can see how you may be. So basically, these facts give us cause for concern about the effects of recommender algorithms. Okay, so how do we study those? We don't know this for sure. That's just kind of a theoretical kind of, you can build models like DeepMind built a beautiful model that showed that this is true in a simple kind of mathematical formal model, but we need to know empirically whether this is true. So there's a couple of different ways you can study this. If you're an external academic like me, you're sitting outside the company, there's various things you can do. You can, and there are various methods that you can use. So this is a methodology slide. But there's also things that you can do if you're inside the companies. So I'll talk about the external ones first, because those aren't so good. There's all sorts of problems. One thing, if you ask people to volunteer in a study, so you can look at the effects of recommender algorithms on them, you may not get volunteers from the complete range of people you're interested in particular, if you're trying to study how people develop extremist positions, you may not get in your study volunteers from people who are sort of like incipient extremists or on pathways towards extremism. And there's all sorts of other problems. I won't go through them in too much detail. If you build a simulation, of course, it's just a simulation. So that doesn't tell you a great deal about, it can give you cause for concern, but it doesn't tell you, the chapter and verse on what the effects are on real people. Here's the main one I want to stress. If we're interested in testing this idea that the recommender algorithm pushes you in the direction of harmful content, that's a causation that you're interested in testing. It's a causal hypothesis. But if you want to test a causal hypothesis properly and not just get correlations, you have to intervene. You have to do, what you do in an intervention drug trial or something. You might have a control group and then an experimental group. And then if you see an effect, you know that you've caused it. And that's, of course, what social media companies can do, because they're, external researchers can't intervene. They can just observe. But social media companies themselves can intervene, and they do. And their methods are far, far better. Empirically, this is the gold standard. Companies routinely run studies that intervene. They're called A/B tests. What you do is you say, I'm going to create this completely random, huge group of users, and then this other completely randomly chosen, huge group of users. And then you just give them slightly different versions of a recommender system, maybe with different inputs or different hyperparameters or whatever. And then you just sit and wait and monitor the behaviors and measure them. And if you see any difference in those behaviors, by God, those differences are a causal effect of the difference in the recommender system. They couldn't be otherwise. There's only that explanation. Of course, companies are mostly interested in measuring user engagement because they want to keep you engaged with the platform as much as possible, because that's their business model. But you can also measure anything. If you wanted to measure engagement with harmful content, you could do that. And then you get a sense, if this version of the algorithm brings people into contact with more harmful content of one kind or another than this one, well, then you know that companies have some agency over how much content, harmful content users are seeing. That's what we'd like to do. And that's the experiment that we proposed to various social media companies. To start off, we worked in the Christchurch call. So as I said, if you don't know about this, it's from 2019 when there was this awful attack in New Zealand by a white extremist on mosques in Christchurch, and many people were killed. Crucially, these mosque attacks were live streamed on social media by the killer, and that led to a really fast and interesting grouping of people where New Zealand and France as well actually got together with various other countries and all the big tech companies and created a commitment basically to eliminate terrorist and violent extremist content, this category of content called TVEC, in various ways. And all the big social media companies signed up. So we thought, okay, since you've signed up to that, maybe you'd like to run an A/B test with us, and we'll collaborate with you so we can see if you have any agency over TVEC content on your site in the A/B test that you've already run. But companies participate voluntarily on this. This is not black letter law. This is a matter of voluntary engagement. And we just didn't get any sign up from any companies. And there's one qualification there. We got really close with what used to be called Twitter, to the point where in the summit just last year, late last year in autumn, in the Christchurch Call Summit, an initiative was announced between Jacinda Ardern and François Macron, where we were going to work on exactly this A/B tests thing in a way which would allow external researchers to ask whatever they wanted, And then Elon Musk took over, and the whole thing was basically everyone from the Twitter team that we were working on was sacked, like within 1 week. And that's probably the end of that. So we sort of pivoted towards the EU at that point. We're now working under the Digital Services Act, which provides exactly the powers of audit that we would need. And we're still negotiating with DSA regulators, the European Centre for Algorithmic Transparency in particular, in Madrid, to see if we can do these A/B tests in areas of harmful content so that we can test those cause for concerns that I showed you about. Okay, that's that one. The third one, this is the one that Inmar was plugging. So I'll spend most of my time talking about this and then leave some time for questions. So this is about ChatGPT and so on. And our original focus on this was to do with how those things impact social media, but in fact, it goes much broader than that. So the issue for a social media company is what to do about AI-generated posts. We can imagine that there's going to be a lot of AI-generated content on social media, and what should social media companies do about that? I suppose it's the general question. And the key thing there, and this is something I've mentioned from the crowd a few times in the last week, these things, I'll call them foundation models because that's the word that the EU is currently using. But it's just generative AI models. Allow users to generate harmful content at an industrial scale. And I'm thinking particularly there about political disinformation, the sort of thing which might destabilize democratic elections, for instance. But there's other sorts as well. But that's the key focus, because political disinformation impacts on political elections is absolutely crucial, because if you don't get good governments elected, then you can't do many of the other things that we've been talking about in this conference. The key thing is that foundation models lower the bar on generation of disinformation. So you don't have to be a very good writer in order to produce some pretty damning and very convincing looking stories about your political rivals. So this is something which can easily be done, and we anticipate it's going to happen a lot. And many politicians and many commentators are very worried about this. So what should we do about it? And what should social media companies do about it? But more generally, what should we all do about it? And obviously what's needed, well, I say obviously, this is what we think, is a reliable way of detecting content that's generated by an AI model. You know, a generative AI tool is a general purpose thing. And what you need to make that thing safe, or at least to know what comes from such a thing, is a general purpose tool that can look at anything and tell you, oh, this comes from an AI model. This doesn't. So this is from a person, this is from a human, and this is from some mixture or whatever. So detection technology can help keep foundation model technology safe. And this is one of these classic things. We've had a few examples of this in the last few days, where there's a problem with this AI model. And so you take this other AI model to help address the problem. So you can use AI models to keep other AI models. In this case, you can use an AI content detection tool to keep to provide some measure of transparency about the outputs of an AI content generator tool. Hope that makes sense. So, of course, detectors for AI-generated content are going to be really important, not just in social media, but in all domains. So at this point, I'm sort of broadening out beyond social media, I think. And that's because the world is about to be flooded with AI-generated content. A lot of it will arrive on social media, but it might arrive elsewhere. For instance, if I'm a teacher, I'm a professor, if I receive an essay by my student, by God, it could have been written by AI. And so, you know, but it's the same in any professional context, right? Someone who commissions a piece of work and then gets a report has these new questions about attribution that they never had before, like they didn't have last year, which is to do with, well, did the person really write this? So we kind of argue, well, this is a point for discussion. We've written a couple of papers about this. In the first paper, we really did assert that there's a right, almost like a new human right, to know what comes from a machine and what comes from a person. I don't know if it needs to be stated in those terms, but I think we certainly need to know. So our GPA group is proposing a new rule, a piece of regulation, basically, and it's stated in that bullet point. The company that develops a new state-of-the-art foundation model should be required to demonstrate a reliable detection mechanism for the content that that foundation model produces as a condition of its public release. And then it has to provide that detection mechanism for free to users of the system. So that's I think it's a practical thing. I'll sort of, oh yeah, just one point before I go on to the practicality. You can't build a reliable detection mechanism if you're external to the company that's doing the generation, because the generation tools are so good, like the language that they're producing is so human-like that you can't tell the difference. It's increasingly hard to tell the difference, and in a few years it'll be completely impossible, we believe, many other people too. So what that means is if you want a reliable detection mechanism, you have to instrument your generative model to support that detection mechanism. So each generator has to come with its own paired detection tool. That's why we think this responsibility lies with companies, and that's why we want a rule that recognizes that. So we argue, and this is the point about practicality, that with the right instrumentation, detection mechanisms are technically feasible. And we've talked about this a few times, and most of the discussion is about watermarking schemes. And as we've heard in the conversations, watermarking schemes are somewhat effective, but quite brittle, actually. If you take a text that's generated by AI and you change some of the words, and especially if you put it through a paraphraser engine, so there are paraphrasing tools out there, then you can overcome and evade detection by that process. The watermarking scheme doesn't resist that. But there are other methods as well. And actually, the field of possible methods is really broad, but right now, the best scheme that we've seen is far less well known and far better, actually. So what you do, if you're OpenAI, you simply keep a record. You keep a log of all of the content that that ChatGPT generates, privately, of course, a big escrow log. And then you can run a detection tool simply as a plagiarism detector on that private log. And plagiarism detector is old technology. Plagiarism detection is information retrieval. That's what Google does, right? So the big tech companies are the absolute authorities on how to do information retrieval. This is a no-brainer for them. It's easy technology. It's old-fashioned technology. Right now, this is state of the art. This is much better at, is more robust to paraphrase attacks and for changing a few words. So, but we don't want to insist that it has to be done this way. We want to leave it to the companies who are, after all, the acknowledged kind of like leaders in all areas of AI, to find out what the best way is of providing a detection mechanism that works, in the current adversarial context, whatever that is. And then, yeah, so you don't express it in terms of, you need to watermark your system. No, you just say, you need to provide a reliable detection tool. And that's the way we said it in the bullet point up here. So we're not including in our proposed sort of piece of rules that that companies should choose this method or this method. No, that's entirely up to them, and they can think about it however they want. So an interesting way of doing it this way kind of links to something I've already talked about. So if companies are required to, if there's a hurdle that companies have to pass, which is creating a reliable detection system in order to be able to release their new fancy model, suddenly there's a new principle of competition between companies, which is that they, have to compete on detection technology. And that's a point where now suddenly they're competing on something which is completely in the interest of public safety. And this is a very good thing economically that you'd like to do in AI policymaking. You'd like to sort of change the competition that's operating economically between companies, and so that it pushes in the direction of public good. And that's something that we also saw in the first thing I talked about, training hate speech classifiers. The idea is that you can make, by having the training set for a hate speech classifier curated outside of companies, so they all use the same one, you suddenly make them compete about who's got the best hate speech detector. Again, you're making them compete on a technology that promotes the public good. And that's a nice sort of general point that I wanted to sort of bring out, that we're sort of constantly thinking about how we can make companies compete in these areas, as well as just on market share. So our proposed rule, we have a couple of papers about this. They're both co-authored by some really big cheeses in AI who've both been participating in our project. Yoshua Bengio, who basically invented the technology that transformers run on, and Stuart Russell, who wrote the textbook and is very well known for his work on AI alignment. So our proposal has had some traction, and that's what Inna was mentioning yesterday. So it's sort of been incorporated into the EU Parliament's amendments to the AI Act that are specific to foundation models. So just, if you don't know about this, the AI Act was almost passed, and then ChatGPT came along and they thought, oh, well, hold on, wait, we need to amend our thing to make it kind of like sort of suitable for for these new technologies like ChatGPT and Midjourney and so on. So the new amendment, which is supposedly, we've been working with a few MEPs who said that they took our principle into their discussions, and what they ended up with, is of course a bit of a mixture because these things are the subject of negotiation. But there's one recital, and it's a recital rather than an article. And so we still would like changes to this to see something a bit more explicit about this in the articles of the amendments. But the amendment that's in the EU Parliament that they've agreed on is that generative foundation models should ensure transparency about the fact that the content they produce is generated by an AI system, not by humans. So we think it could be restated more clearly, but that's what we have at the moment in there. And of course, this is still subject to those tripartite negotiations, and we've talked to the other groups of people who are thinking about this, and we hope that we'll get something more explicit. It was also discussed in the US just a few weeks ago. There was this very interesting Judiciary Committee hearing in the Senate on AI safety. And both Yoshua Bengio and Stuart Russell were called to that. There were three of them. Dario Amodei was the other one from Anthropic. And the senators were basically quizzing them about the prospect. This is nearly what they mostly were talking about. The prospect that generative tools like ChatGPT are going to be used to create disinformation, which will destabilize the US election next year. This is absolutely forefront of their mind. So there was a lot of talk about this principle that you might be able to make a workable detection tool. And so there's been some traction in this idea also there. There's a few issues for a discussion. I'll mention them quickly because I'd like to leave time for questions. But in the second paper, so we've written two papers there. The first one is already out. The second one is still in press. So if you'd like a copy, I'm happy to circulate, and maybe there are other things we can add. But what we did was in the second paper was to summarize the idea and then just talk about the discussions that we've had with various different people in the EU, in the OECD, and many other places about this proposal, because some interesting things have to be talked about, and any of these could be a roadblock for this proposal. Some of them are technical, some of them are more sort of economic, some of them are policy making. So we often get asked, okay, what happens if you have a text which is partly written by a person and partly written by a machine? And in relation to that, the basic idea is that the detection mechanism, whatever it is, it's got to have statistical significance when it reports its decision that, about something. Well, that means it has to operate on units of content that are a certain size. So for images, that can be quite small because images have tons of information in them. For text, you need to have a reasonable amount of text. It might have to be 100 words, or it depends on what the requirements are and what's possible. But what we envisage is people doing things, is the system reporting in the same sort of way that Turnitin does. So it might say, well, this piece here we found in our database, this piece here we didn't. So this is definitely copied. This is not, well, we don't know. This is definitely copied. Like, this comes from this AI system. This comes from this one. We can't find it. It's probably human. And that's another related point. So each company in our proposed scheme would make its own detector for its own generator. So that means for a user-facing product, what you'd need is some aggregation of the results from those different detectors, and who would do that, and what would the aggregator look like, how would it be funded? We think it's interesting to entertain the idea that this could be provided as part of national infrastructure. So it could be a public service, but it could also be done in the commercial domain in various ways. Here's another one. So you have to imagine that any scheme that's set up, any detection scheme that's set up is going to be attacked, and there'll be an arms race, and then you'll have to change the detection scheme and make it better and so on. So what should the rules say about that? And clearly the rules should not refer to specific mechanisms because those will become outdated as the arms race progresses. So it should refer to the result of the system. It should say it has to be a reliable detector. And it should also state, and this is again something the EU amendments don't yet do, it should require reliable detection in the current adversarial context. So you have to account for the possible attacks that are available at the moment, but you can't cater for arbitrary attacks in the future because you can't be expected to know about that as a company. And then there's this economic question: how expensive would this detector tool be for companies? So we again think there's interesting roles for state infrastructure here. So the EU regulators were very heavily concerned about this. They wanted to make sure that EU companies that were working with generative AI models weren't unduly harmed compared to the giant companies that might be able to afford to build their systems much easier. So you might imagine that, for instance, the state or international organizations could work and fund the development of detector tools which they then make available to companies. Then there's the open source question, which is a really interesting one. And we've heard tons about that. So in the context here, the interesting thing is that if you want to sort of police the large companies and make sure that those companies adhere to the rule that, the new release of your giant language model has to be accompanied by a working detection tool, that's easy to police because there's only a few of those and the model is very high profile. Sorry. But the open source world is different. So on that one, just rather pragmatically, we suggest that if an open source system gets wide traction amongst users, then it becomes visible to enforcement. But there are definitely going to be exceptions, and those exceptions are going to have to be dealt with in the way that we currently deal with them, looking for harmful content and the originators of harmful content. So that's all I've got. Just to summarize, there seems to be an enormous amount that we need to do in social media AI governance. I think it's going to be a new commercial sector or a new industrial sector. It's really a lot of work. We need clever people working here. Uses of AI, this is like the conclusion that we've reached through the attempts that we've had to do things otherwise, should be regulated by law, not voluntarily. We haven't had any joy at all in trying to engage with companies voluntarily. Some AI uses could be usefully regulated at a local level, for instance, hate speech. We are very partisan towards what the EU is doing in regulating AI generally. The Digital Services Act, which is an EU thing that's already in force, it just came into force a couple of weeks ago. The social media recommender algorithm seems to be a great tool that will allow us to do ask the kinds of questions that we think need to be asked. The foundation models, the AI Act is potentially a great vehicle. We don't know this yet, but we hope so. And yeah, regulation should make companies compete to produce human-centered technologies. That's it. Thanks. For this. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much for that brilliant and very interesting talk. I'm sure there's lots of questions. There's already several online, but I don't know if there's any in the room who want to ask quick first. Oh, wow, there are indeed many questions. Okay, well, there's already a microphone being given to someone up there, so we'll come here after. Oh, you have a microphone too? Oh, sorry, go ahead, Lee.
I was going to say, congratulations, Ali. I mean, it's an incredibly impressive and important project, and you and your collaborators are doing great work. Just kind of a couple quick reactions on things to think about. And I'm sort of approaching this from the perspective of being from the United States, and we have a very different regulatory structure than the EU. And I understand the priority of the group is regulation and the DSA. Looking at this from the US perspective, I would not put money on the fact that we're going to have anything similar to a DSA in the US, but there may be other, what I see in our government are efforts to try to get to some of the same goals, but through other types of mechanisms. We have First Amendment issues, which may make DSA type regulation very difficult. And I think the Supreme Court's going to have a case on that soon. But what I would sort of encourage you to do is, the White House got voluntary commitments from, it's now up to 15 companies as of this week. And a lot of what you're talking about, to me, seems to fall squarely within those voluntary commitments. And I'm not an optimist that, notwithstanding the insights from Yoshua and Stewart, that Congress is going to do anything this year. But I think, working with the White House, working with the administration, because the $64,000 question from my perspective is, how are those companies actually going to implement the voluntary commitments. And I think bringing this to the forefront could really be helpful. Working through NIST, that's done really great work with the AI risk management framework, again, very high level. But they have I don't know if you're familiar with it, but they have a public initiative to try to implement the AI RMF for LLMs. And Tony Behrens at Berkeley has been doing some great work there. So I think that's another area. And my last comment, and then I'll be quiet, is I'm just so inspired by your great work. But I mean, I think the Gen AI is really important, but I think the other two on the hate speech and the recommender systems are really important, and particularly like around recommenders. One issue that's getting a lot of attention in our country and globally is, how are the recommender systems influencing mental health, the kids' safety issues, and holding big tech accountable, like putting solutions out there and saying, here are ways, concrete ways that you can address this. Because like from President Biden's perspective, the safety, the kids' issues are top of mind for everybody. It's hard to disagree over the need to protect kids.
So just on that last point, I mean, those are all great questions. On the last point first, you could absolutely use this A/B scheme that we're thinking about to examine whether there are effects on mental health. And crucially, one thing to say is that we're not planning on doing any new experiments that try to, be bad for mental health. Of course, that would be ethically completely unacceptable. But companies have already done experiments and they've logged the results for their own commercial uses. And our proposal is just to go into the results of those experiments and test those. And under the DSA, mental health is absolutely on the agenda. So the Christchurch call, we couldn't look at that. It was restricted to terrorist and violent extremist conduct, which was a bit, sort of like limiting. But in the DSA, things are much broader, which again makes the scope for the investigation much larger. In relation to what the US companies, or the US has been kind of negotiating with companies in the area of detection tools, it's all been about watermarking. And it's very interesting to see the companies come together and agree that they will institute watermarking schemes. And actually, something I didn't say is that there's self-interested reasons why companies would want to have detection tools, because I'm not sure if you have seen this, but when the companies go out and scrape the web again to produce the next version of ChatGPT or whatever, of course, they're going to scrape a bunch of text that ChatGPT generated. And when you eat your own text like that, actually your model gets worse. It's called model collapse. There's some very interesting papers about that. So self-interestingly, companies need to be able to filter their training sets to remove stuff that's produced by other machines, and not just their own one, but other ones. And so you expect there to be some collaboration there. And I'm wondering whether that's one of the reasons why they're so willing to collaborate on this. But like I said, watermarking schemes are not perfect. And I don't like the idea that of course you should, work pragmatically on what's available at the moment, but there are better technologies than watermarking schemes right now. And in general, what we need to do is to have this principle that you don't build in a mechanism into the description about what you do. You build in this principle that you will build a reliable detection tool. So.
I mean, just speaking on my own behalf, I can't speak for the US government, but I would think that the folks in the US administration would be very interested in that perspective, that perhaps focusing on watermarking, which is what the voluntary commitment says, may not be the answer, and that to achieve the goal of the detection, they ought to be thinking about it more broadly. And I think getting that into the dialogue, I think that's a really good entry point. And the G7 Business Code of Conduct too.
Yeah, true. There's one other point I wanted to make before we go to another question, which is that if you manage to institute a rule which requires reliable detection mechanisms for the EU, and if it's worth for the companies to be in the EU, to do business, then you have a detection scheme which is going to work elsewhere. So this is the classic Brussels effect.
All right, before we do another in the room, there's one online, which is a lot of votes. We'll come back to them, I promise. So what about the bias in general? Something may be considered harmful content or hate speech in one country and not in another one. You touched on this briefly. Is it realistic or even possible to set an international standard?
So we've only thought about hate speech, really. It may be possible to set international standards for other areas of harmful content, but hate speech is often directed at a particular group, and those groups are often very localized. So that's not always the case. So for instance, it may be possible to have an international standard on hate speech towards women or LGBTQ. And those you might imagine going very broad in your sort of annotation exercise. But we're starting very small, just to test the idea. We're not even sure if the community of users is going to be able to come up with a workable collective definition here. We're just trying it out. But it's just an empirical question. But it is interesting to think that some categories of harmful content could be transnational or
even
global.
the two categories you just mentioned, some countries would disagree with those being hate speech, and they would actively promote it at the government level.
That's true, and we're trying to move away from governments being involved in deciding these things. We'd like the idea that governments sort of institute a rule about how hate speech is defined in the community that maybe specifies how the process works and how a citizens' jury is gathered or something like that. But they step back from a first-order definition of what counts as harmful in whatever domain.
Thank you. So that was one online, so we'll go back to the room. I think there was
hi everyone, and thanks a lot for the speech. It's crucially important, and for me coming from Ukraine, and especially touching it, say. But I do have a few common questions. One is about recently I've read An Ugly Truth, a book about Facebook, and I was kind of deeply surprised of all the actually ugly truths unraveling underneath the company, how they tried to build at least something, there was no policies about what's good or what's bad, and it all narrows down towards money, because it's the more people are spending in the Facebook, the more money they get, and they don't want us to spend less time there. Hence, they recommend the system to be targeted towards business values, hence government relations. So it's a hard talk. It's like really hard talk, and it's only the community and government that could do something about that. At least from that book, my one point. And another point was, I'm not sure whether threads are released in Europe, maybe not yet, but they were released in Ukraine. So it was very fun to be actively participating in this newly created social media. It's like a new experiment fully, when everyone just, it's like a sandbox. And there was a very plain recommender system out there, and people were getting together in an old way, just listing each other's, and all machine learning folks all gathered just by listing. Oh, there is nice talk. The nice guys over here. Let's come together. But at the end, even with a very huge and rapid growth of the application, like it even outpassed ChatGPT as in threads, and currently it's a plateau. It's Barbie Twitter, we understand it. It's nice to be here, to be there, but still it didn't continue growth. And those are just comments, questions.
Yeah, so just to sort of respond to that, it's really interesting to imagine that social media platform could be an engine for generating sort of meaningful discussion, consensus, and it completely could. It's just economic pressures that stop that happening. There are some beautiful social media platforms, and I'm thinking of this one called Polis. I'm not sure if you've come across that. Very interesting social media platform, which aims in its recommender system to put things high up if there's consensus amongst them between groups that are normally opposed, and that principle can easily be exploited and looked for. And actually, in our in India project, we have another category which I didn't mention, which is items that collectively the annotators think should be upranked because they are helpful contributions, mature contributions to the political discussion rather than divisive. And so there's again operationally a category for upranking, and the hope there is that you can do more than just kind of like squash the things which are going to create polarization, and actually turn the system into an engine for public good. So that's something I didn't focus on because I think we need to step one step at a time here. Yeah, thank you.
All right, I see many, but I saw I think the woman in the front here had her hand up really at the start.
Thank you very much. I'm Nita Lamprecht. I'm here as a private researcher and also for my legal think tank, the Liquid Legal Institute. Thank you for the great presentation. For me, I see that one very central problem is that the hate speech has no consequence for the human origin, actually. So, and I'm wondering very much, as I'm also researching next generation virtual worlds, metaverses, and one of the questions that I keep asking myself is if we as a human society can afford that we detach communication from humans. So, because for me also law has two purposes, one to protect and to guide the individual, but also the society. So there needs to be a feedback to the society also. But coming back to the origin, wouldn't we maybe need a verification system that always connects information to a human? And I realize that's very problematic in countries that are not democratic. So maybe then an international organization, a human rights organization could fill that gap. And I'm talking about the blind verification.
Yep. So those are both interesting points. One thing that's come up that I didn't mention is instead of a detection tool, you could have provenance tools that keep metadata about the origin of a piece of content. You know, in particular, the history of it. It came from here, it went through this tool, it was paraphrased through this tool. And so if you can instrument the whole ecosystem here so that when information is generated and transferred, there's some record of that and you can, you know, find some way of doing that. And there are methods for doing that, which we heard about in this conference, actually. That's another way of doing things, you know, which would be an alternative to detection tools.
Maybe I'll say, because I think that you're hinting at this. This was the next most voted question online regarding detection tools. Might blockchain as a way to create universal unique identifiers be a possible solution?
Yes, I think so. And that was something that was talked about in the US Senate judiciary hearing as well. That was something that Dario Amodei was keen to sort of like put on the table. But this would be a large change to the ecosystem. And I think we need something quick. And I don't think we'd be able to make the relevant changes soon enough. And so I think for right now, detection tools are the best thing we have.
Thank you. So we'll take one more in the room. I saw a woman with her hand up, sorry, already there. But then after that, we'll go to the coffee break. I encourage you, since there's so many interesting topics here, so many people with questions, please ambush him in the coffee break and ask them all then. But last one in the room now.
Yeah, thank you. I keep my question short. I have two small questions. One is, two are related to the third-party detection system. The first one is actually coming from my personal experience. Like, do you think there will be a risk, like if you put a watermark, this actually offer the content provider as a disclaimer? Because I read that already on internet said, well, it's generated by large language models and we don't claim any responsibility for that. So that may, how do you think this be a potential risk in the future? And second point related to do you think it's when coming to put this responsibility implement at corporate level, social media companies or B2B company or B2C companies, they should have different responsibility. In my own experience, I'm working more like a B2B corporate, when we deliver this GPT solution potentially in the future, the customer knows it's GPT based. There's no need.
So to take that second question first, there's already tons of regulation out there that says if you are interacting directly with a customer or a user and you're an AI system, you have to let them know that. So there's lots of rules, for instance, California's Bot Act, and there's things in the AI Act that's coming out about that as well. So direct interaction is already quite well covered by legislation. What we're concerned about is the case where I'm a user, I generate some AI content, and then I take it and I put it elsewhere. I can stick it on social media or something like that. So it's indirect uses of AI where the content just goes out into the world. And we need ways, we argue, that a consumer, a citizen, has some way of knowing what's what, And I think outside of it, direct interactions, the only way of doing that is through something like a detection tool. What was your second question? Your other question? We can talk about it offline. Sorry.
Yeah, we'll talk about it in the break. Thank you very much. I think let's all thank Ali again. This was fantastic.
Thank you. Thank you.